the first book, there are two where we have available downstairs. The first one, which is called Breaking India, it actually starts with a history of how the Western scholars constructed this idea that there was an Aryans came from overseas. There was this idea of Aryan invasion, and then later they said no invasion because they couldn't find evidence of violence, and so they called it Aryan migration. But whether it is Aryan invasion or Aryan migration, it is the same point they are making, that the Aryas and the Sanskrit and the Vedas came from overseas. Whether they came violently or peacefully doesn't really matter. The point is that they claim a foreign origin of the whole Sanskriti tradition. And so the beginning of this book gives you a history of why they did this. We often blame Christians and we blame British rule, but actually it was done originally by the Germans. And the Germans did it for not colonial reasons and not missionary reasons, but because they wanted to create a sense of their own past history. The French were very proud of being the inheritors of the Renaissance and the great Italian tradition, Roman classics. So they used to teach their children that is our ancient past. And the British pride was based on having the empire. The Germans neither had empire nor were they the successors of the great Roman Greek classics, the Latin culture. So they were considered barbarians in the European textbooks. Even in their own textbooks, they did not have a greatness of past. So they were looking for a great past for themselves to build a nation, because to build a nation you need a sense of history, positive history. And the discovery of Sanskrit being very close to certain European languages and closest of all was German, came as very big news, big bonanza. It was a very big breakthrough for Germans to get this idea that Sanskrit is so close to us. So they started with a huge passion the study of Sanskrit as sort of like something, a way to discover who they might have been, where they might have come from. And originally they used to think, people like Herder and Friedrich Schlegel in his early years, used to think that, and they used to teach that actually Germans came from India. They used to think that way. That the Germans are the descendants of Indians and they are more pure, real descendants, whereas other Europeans are sort of, they've decayed and they are not, they're not as superior descendants, they are sort of like corrupted descendants. This was the original idea of how Germany relates with the Sanskrit past. But then it changed and Germans started rejecting the idea that Indians are Aryans and Germans are the descendants. That was not sort of popular. And they came up with something which was just the reverse of that, that the origins of Sanskrit and the Indo-Sanskrit, Indo-Aryan, Indo-European languages was somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Russia or somewhere like that. And so then it gave the Germans a sense of their historical past without having to feel that their ancestors might have been Indians. So the football went back and forth between people who were pro-India as the origin, and against that view was the foreign Aryans. These two camps were competing, and the camp that won in the European discourse, in their academic discourse, was the one that said that the Aryans came from overseas into India, and Germans are very special. They're the original Aryans and things like that. This is a very important part of European history because it led to the rise of Germany as a nation without which they did not have a unified story. They did not have a unified grand narrative about their past. What we would call itihas, they did not have something like that. And this idea of their past being some Aryan past and being the successors of all the Sanskrit, being the inheritors of all the Sanskrit traditions, became their story for creating a nation. And then this went on, and decades later, generations later, led to the Nazis. They appropriated the swastika, they appropriated the word Aryan, and of course did all kinds of havoc. So the distortion of the history led to drastic consequences. And so it's a very important part, the appropriation of Sanskrit and the Arya, idea of the Arya, and the whole Sanskrit tradition, the Vedic tradition, into a distorted account of history led to quite a catastrophe. I come across Indians who are apologetic about swastika, and I'm not. I basically tell Americans, suppose Bin Laden had appropriated Statue of Liberty as his symbol, then you're not supposed to apologize because he has misused it. So it is our symbol, and we don't have to apologize that somebody else did something wrong with it. We must be strong and be able to tell the truth and answer the questions with a lot of detailed knowledge. So about 10 years ago, there was a Hindu-Jewish summit. The Jewish people wanted to have a summit with Hindu leaders. And they approached Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who is head of the Hindu Dharma Acharya Sabha, because he has brought many Hindu groups under this umbrella, and wanted to have the summit. So I was asked by Swamiji to be the scholar, part of their team. And there was a meeting amongst ourselves, among our Dharma people, to figure out what's going to be our strategy when we deal with the Jewish side. So most of the people were advising that we'll talk about there's one God, we'll talk about we all love each other, we'll talk about peace. So I said that there's nothing distinct and nothing new. That is normal interfaith conversation, and nothing comes out of it because those are very common, obvious things. We should say something very different. We should say something a little bit provocative. We should try and change their mind on something. We should have an agenda of what is our need. After all, they're approaching us because they need a common front in fighting Islamic expansionism. They have a goal. They are trying to get Hindus on their side for a certain reason. What do we want from them? So Swamiji said, well, you propose something for our brainstorm. So I proposed that we should give a talk on the correct meaning of swastika, and we should criticize this idea of Aryan invasion and Aryan migration theory. And that is a very provocative thing to tell Jews, because in Jewish Holocaust, swastika is a very horrible symbol, and Aryan is an illegal word in some countries. In Germany, if you say you are Aryan, it's illegal. And so we, rather than living in the fear of symbols that have been misused, we should reclaim those symbols. We should educate them that this is the wrong use of symbols. And I was the only person feeling this way, and everybody else in the brainstorm were scared. They said, no, this is very risky. You can't do it in the first meeting. Jews won't like it. So I said, Swamiji, what's the point of having a meeting where we're telling them obvious things, they'll tell us obvious things, and somebody wanted to teach the whole Vedanta, somebody wanted to teach Vedic thought according to X or Y. I said, they're not here to learn philosophical metaphysics of our culture. They want to understand how we can work together. So what we want from them is what we should present. And one of the things we want from them is that we want to demonize, reverse the demonization of Sanskrit, of Vedas, of Arya, of swastika, these kind of things. So finally, Swamiji said, okay, you prepare a talk, we'll include it. So the first summit of Hindu-Jews was held in Delhi. And there was a big, nice room with a 5-star place, and on one side were the Jewish people. The chief rabbi from Israel had come. Chief rabbi, he's got a cabinet rank in the Israeli government, chief rabbi. He'd come, and all the Jewish experts had come. On the other side were various dharma groups, various leaders of various organizations, and I was also there. So the Jewish side spoke, and then various acharyas spoke. And then Swamiji said, now Rajiv, you say. So I knew that was my cue. I'm supposed to provoke. So Swamiji also said he will say a few things that might provoke, but he will say them, like that. So I told them these things. I told them that Jewish people have been given the wrong impression of what Arya means. Arya is nobility. Aryan is not a Sanskrit word. As a race, Arya is quality, and it does not refer to a race. And in fact, the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, which are called four, that is their main belief, in the original Sanskrit they're called four Arya Truths. They're not referring to a race of people, they're referring to a certain quality of life, certain sophistication, high life, high moral thinking, high dharmic life. And then I said that this swastika, whether it is clockwise, anti-clockwise, doesn't matter, but this has been misappropriated and given a demonic correlation. It has been correlated with horrible deeds. But that's not the fault of the symbol, and it is not the fault of the tradition, and we would like to explain to you what it is. So I went on like this. In fact, I told them quite a lot of other things also, like we have idea of karma and reincarnation. And we do not have an idea of Adam and Eve, original sin, one life, like that. And I said, we respect other points of view, but this is our point of view. Now, all the delegates on the Hindu side, the acharyas, are very quietly sitting, like, my God, this guy. But when my talk was over, the chief rabbi from the Jewish side, he spoke through an interpreter. Interpreter was a major Jewish leader in New York. He said, congratulations, I've learned something new. I'm so happy you told me this, because we were also wondering, we're going to have this Hindu-Jewish summit, but how do we talk about these issues, these particular symbols, this particular controversy? It's very good that you told us this. And now we are so happy to know that this is the real truth, and what we've been told all along in our history is not correct. So he proposed that we should set up a joint team of scholars to investigate this, so that the Jewish people are satisfied that what I've said is not just made up. So he said, we'll appoint some scholars from our side, and Swamiji, you appoint scholars from your side. We'll spend 1 year, and they will research what he's saying and come up with a position paper. And so a team was set up. I was one of the 2-3 scholars from our side. They had scholars on their side, and we sent papers back and forth. A year or two later, we had some meeting in New York, we had meeting in London, and then finally there was a meeting in Jerusalem, and a resolution had to be passed by 2 sides. So I wasn't able to come because of some family illness, but I got a call from Swamiji that you send a draft, you propose a draft. So in the draft, I wrote that both sides agree that swastik is not a demonic symbol, it's a sacred symbol of the Hindus, of Vedic culture. There is no bad Aryan guys who came and invaded India. The Germans had no right to call themselves Aryans. The Arya is a certain term of nobility, high respect. I drafted all this, exactly our point of view. And the leading representatives, all the representatives on the Jewish side, starting with the head of the head rabbi in the cabinet, and all the acharyas from the Hindu side signed it. And we have a scan of it, we have it on our website. So official acknowledgement by the highest authorities on the Jewish side is a very, very big accomplishment. So, if nothing else comes out of this, one thing I would like you to do is, if you are interested, we can send you that draft, that official resolution with all the signatures on it. And you should very confidently talk about this point to reclaim our symbols so that our kids are not embarrassed. Because my kids went to private school in Princeton, and all the Indians are very scared. You can't say swastika, you can't wear swastika. So one fellow bought a new car and he took it to the mandir near Princeton. And the Pandit, while blessing it, put swastika on the front hood of the car, you know. So this guy is very nervous. He said, no, before I go to the parking lot, I have to wipe it out. I said, why wipe it out? Why? So we have a fear. We have a fear. And this is a very bad psychosis, or it's a bad thing to suppress this kind of thing. And we should fight it. So my foundation, Infinity Foundation, which given 400 grants and more than that to various causes is about our Vedic civilization. One of them was to the school where my kids went, and we wanted to introduce a study of Indian religions, Dharma religions in the school system, because they were teaching world religions, and the teaching of Hinduism was not very authentic. So I took 2 teachers. As part of the first grant, I took 2 teachers with me to India. And we went to Haridwar, went to Rishikesh, we went to various places, various mandirs we went to. And before I went, I told them what are some of the important conclusions that they should bring back and teach the kids. So one of the things I told them that you're likely to come back is a changed attitude towards the word Arya and the swastika. And these 2 teachers said, no, that is one thing we cannot do. You don't know how much trouble it will be. If we ever try to talk like that, parents won't like it, because it's a upscale school, private school, and a lot of Jewish families have kids there. So when we were in India, every small town we would go, I would say that says swastika restaurant, this says swastika something, behind the bus there is swastika, behind every car, truck there is some swastika. So every time I would keep pointing out, I would say, get a picture of this and how many swastikas there are. So if you are going to bring students, the plan was to bring students during spring break to India and have 2 weeks of immersion in Indian spirituality. That was our plan, and we achieved it. So these guys finally said, yes, swastika is everywhere. We might as well tell that to the parents before the kids come. Otherwise, they may be shocked. So when we went back to Princeton, there was a debriefing in my house. The principal was there, the head of school, parents, everybody. And so I had these teachers give them a slideshow of all the things we did. The elephant that we're riding, he's got swastika. Every temple place swastika. I made them photograph Buddhist temples which have swastika. I have Buddhist temples in Korea with swastika. Jain temples, Sikh temples, swastika. To show that this is a very solid, old, thousands of years before Hitler and all these Germans knew anything about it. This has been there for a long time. We cannot tamper with its original meaning. So it became part of the school comparative religion, world religions culture, to teach stereotypes, false stereotypes, misinterpretations, distortions. And this became part of the school system where my kids raised. And then other schools in the area started doing similar things. So if you stand up for what the truth is, you can make a difference. This is very important for you to do. And reclaiming our symbols and reclaiming our philosophy and what we stand for is allowed in North America, it's allowed in USA, it's allowed in Canada, and you should be definitely doing that. So the first book is how this Aryan idea was accompanied by another idea that the European missionaries brought. Once the Germans had started this Aryan idea, the British took it very quickly because they could use it for their political purpose. They created this idea that there are Dravidians, because if there are Aryans, then those who are not Aryans should be called Dravidians. So they created this Dravidian. They had 2 camps of Western scholars, those studying Aryan as something to do with Europeans, and those studying Dravidians as the original natives of India, and they created this north-south divide very successfully. And Bishop Robert Caldwell, who in the early 1800s started this Dravidian idea, Dravidian language, Dravidian race, Dravidian religion, Dravidian culture, trying to separate them in every sense, separate Dravidian history. In Chennai, in the main square, right in the center, very important part of Chennai is a huge statue of Robert Colbert. So it became something that the Dravidian political people thought is good for them to rabble-rouse and arouse Dravidian votes. So the whole politics of Tamil Nadu became Dravidianized over the last few generations. And the book traces the mischief started in the early 1800s and why it is not authentic, why the Tamil classics, which are the two big Tamil classics are the Shaiva Siddhanta and the Tirukural, do not have any reference that we are separate from the north, do not have any sense that we are non-Hindus, they are Brahmins, we are something else, they are Aryans, we are not, Sanskrit is a foreign language imposed on us, Sanskrit is oppressive. All this stuff that you hear today is propaganda, which is very recent, last 100 years this has been made up. There is no earlier evidence in Tamil literature that the people felt that way. So this is very important. There is no older memory. So now they are fabricating different kinds of history. They are fabricating that the whole Tamil and Dravidianism is linked with Christianity. Now they've come up with that. That's actually Saint Thomas came and tried to teach them Bible, and they were too foolish. They were not educated. They could not understand it. So they took the dictation wrong, and that is what the Tamil classics are. So it's kind of a very big insult on the Tamil classics. And these things are being turned into epic movies. The DMK actually gave funding for such things. And then in 2005, there was a conference in New York on history of South Indian religions. And Hillary Clinton, senator at that time, sent a congratulatory letter which they published in their proceedings, in the program. And I have a copy of all the papers that were presented, and we have summarized them in one of the appendices of the book. And they're all talking about the real history of South Indian religions is that they're nothing to do with Hinduism. They've got nothing to do with these Aryan people and these Vedas, and that this is somehow a different religion, and it is linked with Christianity, and it is linked with St. Thomas and things of that sort. So then they've had annual conferences every year, getting bigger and bigger. They made this kind of stuff part of the educational curriculum. Many, many PhDs have come out of Christian seminaries in India talking about these things. So the first book, Breaking India, talks about these problems, and it also talks about today how Western nexus is. I didn't find Canadian, but a lot of US and a lot of European nexuses, partly the church, partly human rights groups, partly academics, partly government, think tanks, people like that, are involved in interventions to break up India into these different fighting groups, North, South, Dravidian, Aryan, Dalit, non-Dalit, like that. Rick Santorum is described in my book in detail. There is some reference to what Rick Santorum is up to through his connections when he was in the Senate. So the book is quite courageous in the sense I'm not afraid of naming people. I'm naming people, mentioning them by name. Some are Indians, some are Westerners, Europeans, Americans, different kind of people. And if they have a problem, they can fight, and we will prove our case. We are not afraid. So we have mentioned all these things. So one of the interesting things is there is a group called Dalit Freedom Network. And a lot of people in the academy quote Dalit Freedom Network like some voice of Dalits. Indian newspapers quote Dalit Freedom Network. They've got a great media infiltration everywhere in the world. But I did research on Dalit Freedom Network. They're headquartered in Denver. There is not a single Dalit among the founders, among the trustees. They're all white Christians, Republicans, right-wing type people. Some of them, if you look at their voting record in the US, it's very racist. So they're very prejudiced, racist, ultra-right-wing conservatives in their own country. But here they are trying to give freedom to Dalits around somewhere else in the world. Strange. So I wanted to see why are they doing this. And then I came across a scholar in Princeton. I was just having lunch, and this scholar in Princeton joined the lunch, and he said he had just come back from India. And I said, what were you doing in India? And he said, I'm part of the Afro-Dalit movement. So I said, what is this Afro-Dalit movement? I had never heard of such a thing. He said, oh, it's a movement, what we have come up with the conclusion that Dalits are India's blacks. And all the non-Dalits are like India's whites. And just like there was racism in America, and the whites were oppressing the blacks and kept them as slaves, so same thing is happening in India. So we are trying to empower the Dalits, and we're trying to get them freedom from the non-Dalits of India. So this is very dangerous and mischievous, I thought. So I went to this guy's office, and he had a big map of India, balkanized. The north was called Mughalistan, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, all over North India to Bangladesh and beyond. It was called Mughalistan. And then south was called Dalistan, Dravidstan, and so on. And I thought this is some kind of a joke, but then I did not want to tell him that I don't like this. I made it look like I'm interested, I'm just curious. So he told me who is funding it, who's sending such people to India, how they are doing what they call youth empowerment camps. And so everybody thinks youth empowerment is good, but how they're empowering the youth is hatred, separatism. Your ancestors were oppressed and made slaves by the other Indians' ancestors. So one Indian against another. They're trying to create that. So the map, I got a soft copy from this guy of the map. He told me there's a site called Dalistan.org. And if you go to Dalistan.org, they have a copy of that map also. So when I wrote this book, Breaking India, I put this on the cover of the page of the book. And the whole map, cover of the book, which is their breakup of India map, to explain it to inside the book what it means. 2 weeks before the book was about to come out, I get a call from the publisher. Oh, no, our legal department says it's very dangerous, If we put this map, we might get banned and we'll get in trouble and so on. So I said, but we are, in fact, the book is a criticism of what this map is claiming. So then they said, okay, we had a big argument, and the compromise was that they said they'll make the map small, as if it's less dangerous if it's small, And I've never before seen on any book's cover asterisk and a disclaimer saying, we really don't believe in this map. Huh? Yeah. So that is how fearful people are of just the truth coming out, just the truth coming out. So that is how, if you get the book downstairs, you will see the map. Small, they made it. But on my website, if you go to breakingindia.com, we have the full big map. And no disclaimer or anything like that. So that book, basically, Breaking India, is about how there are forces that have been working for a while to interfere in different parts of India to try and break it up. Because time is, I've already run out of time. I haven't even told you anything about my second book, which is a new book. I'll give you at least 2 minutes on that. So second book called Being Different. And the website is beingdifferentbook.com. We added the word book, beingdifferentbook.com. And this is how we are different from the Abrahamic religions, how the Dharma is different from the Abrahamic religions. It is more fashionable to say everything is same, but it is misleading. So many people told me, publishers also, please don't write a book being different, write a book being sane. In fact, I got so many offers, if I would change to being sane. So I felt, there's nothing unusual about writing being sane. Everybody's talking about that. There's nothing new. But being different is very important in multiculturalism. If you are same, then you will be digested and you will cease to exist. You will cease to exist. Because to the extent you are same, you can be replaced by the mainstream equivalent. If a word is replaced from Sanskrit to English, then that Sanskrit word is useless. Why do you need it? Some scholar may look at it, but you don't need it. There's nothing different about it. But if you look at a word like yoga, it's non-translatable. You can't call it exercise, you can't call it gymnastics, you can't call it prayer. Yoga is yoga. So it's a non-translatable. It is non-digestible in the sense that you can't just do away with it, digest it and throw the word out, replace it with something else. So I have a chapter in this book, chapter 5, called Sanskrit Non-Translatables. And I presented this at the World Sanskrit Congress in Delhi earlier this year, 2,000 delegates, and they were very happy, and they said, you come and you introduce this notion of Sanskrit non-translatables. Because in this chapter I have about 20 examples of words which are being commonly translated into English and replaced with English equivalents. And I'm explaining to them that the English equivalent that you're using does not mean the same thing, and you're distorting the meaning. And if a civilization gets mapped to Western universalism, then the civilization is no longer necessary, it's redundant, it's obsolete, it can belong in a museum. You can belong in a museum for something that used to be existing, but you don't have anything distinct to offer. So either we are being different or we are being digested. It has to be one or the other. To not be digested, you must know what is non-digestible. What is different that does not have an equivalent, a substitute in the Western universalism, so that by preserving this difference, you are not getting digested, but you are maintaining your distinctiveness. To me, multiculturalism doesn't mean that we all melt and become pseudo-white and forget who we are. As second class, people, white, pseudo-white, semi-white, honorary white, trying to be white, will become white. But we have to be who we are and be okay with it and be confident with it. And we do it with mutual respect, meaning I respect you as you are and I want you to respect me as I am. And I explain in chapter 1 why the word tolerance is not good enough. You don't want your spouse to say, I tolerate you in the house. You don't want your colleague in the office to say, I tolerate you to sit here next to me. You don't want to be invited to lunch where somebody says, I'll tolerate you to eat next to me. Tolerance is an insult. Tolerance means there's something wrong with you, but I'll put up with you. That's what it means. You're going to hell, but I'll put up with you. That kind of thing. So this whole interfaith use of the word tolerance, I've been fighting for 10 years. And in the first chapter itself, I give you many, many examples. Some of them are very funny, where just changing the word tolerance to the phrase mutual respect creates a huge problem. A lot of people don't want to respect. Tolerate they can, but respect means that you are legitimate. If I respect you, you're legitimate. But then if I think I'm exclusive, I have a certain exclusivity claim, then I have a hard time respecting anybody who's different. So true multiculturalism means mutual respect for difference. It does not mean everybody has to become the same, because then there's no multi left in culturalism. It's monoculturalism. So I explain 4, which I don't have time for, but I explain 4 major areas where dharma differs from the Abrahamic religions. And these are in chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 5 already talked to you about Sanskrit non-translatables, certain Sanskrit words which do not have any equivalent, and every child should be taught these words and use these words while they're speaking in English. Do not replace them with some English word. Use these words and be sure how to explain what they mean, and that is your distinctiveness that you bring, because the distinctiveness is not for chauvinism, it is not for our nostalgia only, it is also because the Western civilization benefits, the Canada benefits, United States benefits, the world benefits when we bring our ideas. Our ideas have brought a lot of yoga, meditation, vegetarianism, ideas of the ecology being sacred. The ecosystem is sacred. The dharma is not only just for me, but also my family, my community, my nation, and the world at large, animals included. When we say Vasudeva Kutumbakam, it's not only humans, it's also animals, it's also plants, all living things. So we bring the ultimate resources for pluralism, which the world needs. The Abrahamic religions do not have pluralism, they offer tolerance. The exclusivity claim of Christianity will not honestly, truly accept the exclusivity claim of Islam and vice versa. And if I have time or somebody asks a question, I can give you a very detailed answer, but being different gives you many, many sections on the incompatibility within the Abrahamic religions because of their exclusivity. And the kind of the multiculturalism and pluralism, which is the architecture of the Dharma, is so deep. It is not something we brought recently because of political correctness. It's not because we are trying to be politically expert we start tolerating and we start saying these things. These things have been there from the very beginning. So we bring many contributions to modern society, which means we must preserve and protect what is distinct about us. And therefore, we have to be different and not be digested. Thank you.
For the temples or the other organization, how can we attract the young people? Like I have teenagers and all that. They used to go to Shakha temples and all that, but now if I try to bring them, it's like a lot harder. So my fear is in the future they may not be Hindus.
Yes.
They could end up a church or somewhere else.
Digested.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a very common thing. You see, our dharma has a very unique quality that we have separated Shruti and Smriti. Shruti, that which is eternal and permanent, and Smriti, that is being rewritten and for each time and place. So here you are in North America, so you can have an Americanization while you are not compromising the Shruti, while you keep the Shruti as it is. You can take several of your Smriti things, Smriti ideas, practices, and adapt them to be more current for today's generation. There is nothing wrong in that. This has happened many times in our history, which is why we are flexible and adaptable and did not perish, but we kept evolving with the times. So you need to get young people at a young age and listen to them. I do a lot of listening to young people. And I have on the YouTube, I have many talks on Hindu identity, what it is, why we need it, how to project it. In fact, there's a 15-minute video I just put up called Hindu Identity, Why, What and How, where I address these kind of questions. And I do workshops with young people. I'd be more than happy to do one here on this very issue of how you can make the Hindu identity cool. Because, you know, it's very cool to be in yoga. It's very cool to be vegetarian. It's very cool to know meditation. You should be so good at it that they look at you as the expert on these things. And these things have a future in science. The whole neuroscience and cognitive science is being redeveloped, is being enhanced in the West with the study of yogis. That is how functional MRIs on advanced meditators is revolutionizing neuroscience. Quantum physics is being revolutionized with ideas of consciousness that are from our tradition. So if the young people know how Vedic tradition brings in incomparable ideas on sustainability, Vedas and sustainability, everybody will write an essay on it because that's a common topic. Vedas and animal rights, Vedas and the nature, celebration of nature, diversity, Vedic thought and diversity, Vedic thought and health, healing paradigms, new healing paradigms. You have to link Vedic thought with issues of current interest to the current generation. And this is the kind of research I'm doing, and this is the kind of research I'm writing about in my books, so that it is not something for old-fashioned people, for grandfathers and people like that, but for the latest generation. What I'm worried about is that the Western universalism will Christianize whatever they find good, like Christian yoga. They'll Christianize whatever they find good. Erase the Indian history and Vedic history. Erase it. Call it part of the Western history. And then our children will be learning Christian yoga, Christian meditation, Christian theory of vegetarianism, Christian theory of animal rights. All the things that the West has taken from us will be re-exported to our children, who will not know that they got it from our own tradition in the first place. So a lot of books I'm writing are on the Indian origins and Indian contributions to Western universalism. When I challenge Western universalism, one of my challenges is that it is not all Western to begin with. A lot of it came from non-Western sources. So when you tell our people the Western origins of, the Indian origins of A, B, C, D things, it's a
As I understand your Arya Samaj movement, it's it has three eternal entities, which is called triadic, which is God, soul, and matter. But the prevailing, not the prevailing, but the larger movement out there is the Vedantic movement, which is, or Advaita Vedanta, which is one concept. So I'm trying to find out whether I've got it right and whether those two movements or those two thinking, whether they're reconcilable.
Okay. It's a very tricky question, a very difficult question. If I claim to have solved the problem, then I would be claiming to be greater than all our major leaders and thinkers and rishis who've tackled this problem for much longer than me and who are much smarter than me. The problem of non-dualism, qualified non-dualism, and dualism, that kind of a problem has been there for a while in our tradition. I can just tell you what my goal is in this book. My goal in this book is a very difficult challenge, I want you to appreciate my challenge. I want to find out how a family of dharma schools which have differences with each other, how that family has big differences with the opposing family. You see my point? So first of all, we are not one in the sense of being monolithic and uniform and identical within the dharma systems. We have many different schools with different views that are not reconciled very easily. But we are facing an opponent of another family which is very aggressive, which is out to finish us all, and which brings to us a very, very different point of view than ours. So this is my starting point. So what I want to contribute to this is that our family of dharma schools, different and diverse as they are, have certain principles which they share, like certain non-translatables which they share, like karma theory which they share, like no one unique historicity of one event which claims absolutism and so on. Our traditions share that view. So what I'm trying to identify is a set of principles which they share while having all the differences they have, but this common set of principles they share such that these principles are very, very different from those in the Abrahamic systems. So I'm looking for what does this family have that differentiates it from another competing family which is out to eat our lunch, so that rather than trying to reconcile internally the old differences, which I will not be able to in the rest of my life, I want to find certain common principles on which we can build a common bond and a common alliance to face a common enemy. That's really what I'm trying to do. So I am actually doing something very different and new. It's basically saying, it's like any, in India I use the example of coalition government. When you make a coalition government, you acknowledge that all my coalition partners and we got differences. Otherwise we would be one party. But we are 20 parties because we can't agree on many things. But still we are a coalition government because we feel that the other guys are so far different from us and we are so opposed to some of their principles that we better stick together. We better hang together or we'll hang separately. And that's the analogy I give. And that's why I say that the time has come when the bigger Kurukshetra forces are so powerful that we must appreciate what is common amongst us while respecting each other's right to hold on to a different metaphysical idea. I don't mind if my particular sadhana is X and your sadhana is Y, and my X sadhana is based on some X metaphysics and yours is based on Y metaphysics. I have no problem, you do the Y and I do the X, as long as we have some shared principles which we will both join hands and hug each other and embrace each other and to defend them against a common enemy which is 100 times our combined size and power. And if we don't do that, they're going to finish us off anyway, and then when we are dead, who will care whether you are right or me, I'm right? That's my concern.
Dr. Malhotra, a lot of the talk that I've heard and a lot of the terminology I've been hearing seem a lot relative to Hindus coming out of India. The problem I have is that I am from Trinidad. I'm a Hindu. I've been a Hindu for 40-odd years, and like many others, like myself, Hindi is not our first language. We grew up in an English environment, and I have tried to learn Hindi. I know a little Hindi. I can read the Ramayana, but I can't say I know Hindi enough to be able to read the Vedas or anything else. What I was wondering is, what is the possibility of teaching Hinduism in the English language? Is there a risk to us losing our identity by doing that?
See, this is why I believe in identifying certain non-translatable words and introduce them into the English language. First of all, I would not like any of you to replace Ram with God and Krishna with God and Shiva with God and replace and remove the internal differentiation and distinctiveness of all the deities and just call all of them God. I mean, I don't want you to take Indra is God and Agni is God and get rid of all those original names and replace them all with God, because then you've destroyed the nuanced meaning of all these things. And if you are, when I give a talk to people who are into the Shakta tradition, the goddess tradition, tell them, do not remove the difference between Durga and Kali and Saraswati and Ganga and all that, because each of them is a certain aspect and a certain energy and a certain force, a certain type qualities it carries, a certain intelligence, and do not allow that all to be collapsed as goddess. Do not do that. It's very easy to do that, but then in a generation you'll have lost all that. So I feel that keeping key Sanskrit words non-translatable is the strategy that is practical, because you can certainly be a perfectly English-speaking person who understood your mathematics and physics and all your professional career jobs and all those things you understood in English, medicine, you studied all that in English, but while speaking English, why not never just say religion, say dharma? Why, and explain what it means and tell the people what the differences are. And in this book, in one of the chapters, you will see I have a whole section on why dharma is not religion. And read that, understand that. There are tables comparing this side and that side, many tables scattered across. Understand them, interact with me, join our discussion group. If you give me your email address, I'll put you automatically in our discussion group. We have almost 3,000 members now. And that's where people are asking question answers. That's where you meet other people as common resources. And the idea is to start a movement where we protect certain categories that cannot be negotiated and replaced with anything else, while being practical that many of our people are going to be raised in an English environment. I am not happy about it. I want to really encourage the growth of Sanskrit. I want to revive the local languages. Being Different is being translated into Kannada, it's being translated into Hindi. Breaking India is already existing in Tamil. I mean, most authors are not bothering to do that. I'm spending a huge amount to actually get those translations done and finding friends, finding sponsors to get that done, because I really care about it. At the same time, I'm practical. I also realize that no matter how hard we try, there will be a very substantial portion of our people being raised with English as their first language. And so rather than just losing them completely, I would want them to bring a certain vocabulary of Sanskrit into that English language. So this will be a huge help. If a word is brought into English language, not under the control of our own people, you can also have the word misused, like the word Pandit is used. You have Wall Street pundits and you have political pundits, like that. So I'm not talking about a very facile and incorrect appropriation of our word. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where an authentic word, authentic meaning comes along, which means our people have to be actively involved in using it and studying what it means. So yagna is a powerful word for Arya Samaj people. And so do not let it be translated as sacrifice, because I explain in this book, the biblical idea of sacrifice starts with human sacrifice. We're not talking about that. There's human sacrifice in those societies. And then to end all human sacrifice, there is one final human sacrifice called Jesus. Jesus is a human sacrifice. Bible scholars will tell you, Jesus is God sending
that, okay, this will be my own son, God incarnate as Jesus, for a sacrifice so huge, because it is God, the infinite, being sacrificed, that there is no more need for other human sacrifices to continue. So for us, and there's a whole history and baggage with the word sacrifice. And we are talking about a transformation. We're talking about something else in yagna. So the idea of, to me, the notion of translating yagna as sacrifice is a bad idea. We should go through our vocabulary. Every sampradaya, every lineage, every kind of dharma group should have a list of what is non-negotiable, non-portable, non-translatable, different, that we will preserve. That list, a little booklet should be made, and that should be then taught, and then let people speak English if they want, but at least that much you should have.
Muhammad's view about India, he hated, of course. And last year of Jesus Christ in India. So can you put some light on this?
See, Muhammad's view on India, okay, he hated, but I mean, as long as we love ourselves and we are clear on who we are, then it doesn't matter. And I say, who cares? Let him hate us, and I don't care. It's like, I have a sports team, whether it's cricket or hockey or whatever it is. The fact that they've got bowlers who are hating our batsmen, want to get us out, that's what we expect them to do. Our job is to hit them for a six. Yeah, we have to get our act together. And we have to get our act together, train our team, and make sure we're not getting beaten up easily. And they hate us and all that is fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Now, Jesus' lost years in India is a very tricky and dangerous thing which people can spread. It is being used to lower the guard of Hindus to accept Christianity as, it's our own son. It's our own son. The point is that while we may think that Jesus living in India makes him an ordinary yogi and a rishi, along with many, many others, the Christians think they are selling us an idea. Once we accept it, then the exclusivity of Jesus comes in, which means no Ram, no Krishna, no rishis, no other source of authority, and this story in Jerusalem is the absolute story. So it's like when you want to catch a fish, you throw that thing, hook with a bait, and maybe the fish will catch it, and then you can pull it in. And I think this Jesus lived in India is something of that sort. We should be very clear that we believe that the Sanatana truth is available for any person with a high state of consciousness to tune in, like Shruti, to tune in like the rishis. The rishi potential is available to everybody in this room. It may take you many lifetimes, maybe very few will achieve it, but the potential is available to tune in and rediscover for yourself the same Shruti. And whether Jesus may have done it is fine good for Jesus if he had done it. If he hadn't done it, it doesn't really affect us. So whether he came to India and learnt it, whether he didn't learn it, regardless of that, our tradition is still okay. If you prove it wrong, it's not going to affect my tradition. If you prove it right, it's not going to affect my tradition. My tradition stands like it is. I think first we have to secure our people's understanding of ourselves in a very, very solid way, and may let the others, let Christians start thinking about Jesus in India. The Jesus in India is a great message for us to export to Christians, not for us to think about ourselves. Yeah, this is called reverse inculturation. Like Sufism is Islam's export to non-Muslims, but not practiced internally. In Makkah, you can't have Sufi singing. You can't have Sufi singing in Makkah. In Delhi, they have this great Sufi festival in Humayun Tomb. 90% of the people who go there are Hindus, and they're enjoying all this, everything is same, blah, blah, blah. So I know the guy he's a Nawab of some kind, and he's the head of the Sufi Foundation. So I met him in some friend's party, and everybody was, of course, gaga over this great Sufi Foundation. So I asked him a question in front of everybody. I said, why don't you do the Sufi Foundation, the Sufi festival in the Jama Masjid? I mean, if Sufism is, as he was saying, one of the great things which is central to Islam, then why not the Jama Masjid become the world Sufi festival? It will be so great, good for them. Yeah, why not in Makkah do Sufi festival? The whole world will love you if you do that. And he said, no, you can't do it there. You can't. So it's good for export. It's not good for internal consumption. So you see, this has been done by a lot of people. I think Hindus also did it once. Hindus also did this thing very successfully. Buddhism was Hinduism's export model. Export model. Because you could get rid of many things that won't be acceptable to China, Japan. It was sort of remove a lot of things and produce something that can export to them. And it succeeded for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. All those guys, they could not have become Buddhist so easily, a Hindu so easily, but they became Buddhist, It was easier to get in. But I don't think we should allow this Jesus lived in India as a sort of a way of easily exporting Christianity into India. I don't think we should accept it and bring it in. It's a Trojan horse. We'll pull it in, and then when we pulled it in, the Trojan horse will open and things will come out of it. So that's what happens. So one more question. Yeah.
You live in India and I'm out of country for 45 years. Why don't you put a sign, welcome to the country of Dharma, and I'll pay for it? Thank you.
Where would you like me to put the sign?
Wherever you like, sir.
Huh?
Wherever you like.
I have a sign. I have a sign. And you're Dr. Vora?
No.
Okay. So I have a sign, and I would love you to pay for it. And my sign is, I'll tell you what the sign is, but it's a little story I'll tell you. I have evangelists who knock at my door in Princeton. These are young kids who are being trained to go to foreign countries for evangelizing. And in order to get them some experience, they tell them to go around locally and knock at doors and practice and learn how to talk and how to answer questions and how to convert people. So somehow I'm on the database as a non-Christian must be. So once a year they come and they knock at the door. And they're all very well dressed, they're wearing suits, these young men, very good grooming, nice looking ladies, nicely dressed. So I can tell who they are, but I pretend I don't know. So they knock at the door and they say, we'd like to meet you, can we come in and spend a few minutes? So rather than being rude or throwing them out, I always bring them in, I bring them chai, offer them nice, talk to them. And they're engaging in small talk like, nice, so nice day, yeah, nice to meet you, like that. So I also say nice things like that. Then they come to the point. One of them says, have you heard the good news? Now, in Christianity, good news is that the Savior has come to save you from sin. That's the good news. That is the good news, when they say Christian good news. So I pretend like I don't know what this is. So I say, good news, did the stock market go up? What is this good news? And so they all look at each other because this is not the expected answer in their training manual, They must be having a flow chart that when you say this, you will say that, then you say this. So maybe they don't know, they haven't come across a guy who will say that he doesn't know what's going on, So I make it look like I don't know what's going on. So then they tell me that, no, good news is that Savior has come and you can be saved. We all be saved. So I say, saved from what? I haven't done anything wrong. What saved from what? So then they say, no, we are all sinners. We are all sinners. And we have to be saved, and that's the good news that we can be saved. So I say, why are we sinners? You look like nice people. Why are you sinners? So, because I really want to get the whole thing out of them, So then they have to say original sin. We all original sin. So I say, original sin. What is that? Oh, wow, we are all original sinners? They said, yeah, because, Adam and Eve, you don't know about it? I said, no, I don't ever heard about it. So they say, well, Adam and Eve did original sin, and so we have been, all the progeny of Adam and Eve have been eternally damned. So everybody who's born progeny of Adam and Eve are born sinners. And, if you're not saved, we'll go to hell. So we have to be saved. That's the good news. So then I tell them, have you heard the Hindu good news?
And they say, Hindu Good News? What is that, Hindu Good News? They all look at each other like maybe somebody else knows Hindu Good News. I say, Hindu Good News is there is no original sin because we are originally divine. Yeah. So my slogan, which I have trademarked, is called Hindu Good News. And I have a website called hindugoodnews.com, in which I explain this is one of the differences. This is one of the differences that you can either have Hindu Good News or Christian Good News. Because in one case, you are originally a sinner. In the other case, you are originally divine. And this is a difference. So if you would like to sponsor a poster or a banner or a flag, then I would love if you want to put hindugoodnews.com and put them all over Toronto and pay for it. I'll be delighted. Thank you.